She was 19 years old. She weighed barely 100 pounds, and she was walking home along the same quarter-mile of gravel she had walked 6 nights a week for 2 years. On the rainy evening of October 12, 1961, Carol Ann Petrie finished her shift at the telephone exchange in Alder Grove, Oregon, buttoned her red wool coat against the cold, stepped out into the dark, and never reached her own front porch. That is not a story about a girl who lost her way in the rain. That is a story about a man who knew exactly which road she took, exactly when she took it, and counted on the fact that a small timber town in 1961 had no way to catch him. And it would take 62 years, a cardboard box that was nearly thrown in a dumpster, and a single cigarette butt that a careful detective bagged on a hunch he could never explain, to finally give that man a name. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to a wet October in the last good year Carol Ann Petrie ever knew. Because to understand what was taken from Alder Grove that night, you first have to understand who Carol Ann was. Alder Grove in 1961 was a mill town, and it lived and breathed by the mill. The whistle blew at 6 in the morning and again at shift change in the afternoon, and you could set your whole life by it. There were maybe 1,400 people, most of them tied one way or another to the sawmill or the timber that fed it. The air smelled of wet cedar and fresh sawdust and the wood smoke that hung low over the valley when it rained, which in that part of Oregon was most of the time. Log trucks ground down the main road all day long. At night the town went quiet and dark and trusting, the kind of place where nobody locked a door, and the milkman and the breadman knew every family by name and every child by their favorite treat. It was a safe world. Everyone believed that. That belief is part of what makes this story hurt. Carol Ann Petrie was one of the voices of that town, literally. She worked the switchboard at the telephone exchange, which in 1961 meant she connected nearly every call in Alder Grove by hand, plugging brass jacks into a board and saying number, please 1,000 times a night. People knew her voice before they ever knew her face. Old Mrs. Harmon, who was going deaf and lonely, used to call the operator just to have someone to talk to, and Carol Ann never once cut her short. That was the kind of girl she was. She was 19, and she had been carrying more than her share since she was 15, when her mother died of a cancer that took her fast, and Carol Ann quietly became the one who packed lunches and mended shirts and raised her little brother Danny, while their father worked doubles at the mill. Danny was 11 that autumn, and he worshipped her. She helped him with his spelling at the kitchen table and let him listen to the radio one program past his bedtime if he'd been good. And she never told their father. Carol Ann had one dream, and she kept it in a coffee can on the kitchen shelf with the word nursing written on the side in her own careful hand. Every tip, every spare dollar from the switchboard went in that can. She was less than a year of savings from the training program down in Eugene, and on Sundays she read a second-hand nursing textbook at the kitchen table with a pencil behind her ear, quizzing herself out loud while Danny pretended not to listen. And she had one small ritual her brother never forgot. Every night she worked the evening shift, she left the porch light burning for herself and told Danny to leave it on until she was safe inside. Because a lit porch, she said, meant somebody was still coming home. It was her way of saying the day wasn't over until everyone was accounted for. On the night of October 12th, that light burned until morning. Danny would spend the rest of his life unable to look at a porch light without thinking of it. He didn't know it that evening, but the last ordinary thing his sister ever said to him was to leave it on. The timeline that Sergeant Walt Cutler pieced together in the days that followed was painfully short. Carol Ann's shift ended at 9 o'clock. A co-worker watched her leave through the front door of the exchange at 9:05, pulling her red coat tight. At 9:20, a man closing up the filling station on the corner saw a girl in a red coat walking north on Cedar Road, alone, in the rain. That was the last confirmed sighting. Her route home was 3/4 of a mile of gravel road lined with alder and blackberry, and she covered it on foot every night. She should have been through her own door by 9:35. Danny sat up watching the porch light and the clock. By 10, he woke his father. By 11, half the mill crew was out on Cedar Road with flashlights and lanterns, the rain coming down harder. Men calling her name into the dark and getting nothing back. They searched all night. The rain never let up. By dawn there were 40 men on that road, and a dread settling over all of them that nobody would say out loud. They found her the next morning, just off the road, in a stand of alder not 200 yards from her own house. She had been so close. That was the detail that undid people. A grown man who'd searched all night sat down on the wet gravel and wept when he understood how near she'd made it. I won't dwell on what they found. This is a story about who she was and who took her, not about the worst minutes of her life. What matters is what Sergeant Walt Cutler noticed a few feet away, half sheltered under a fern where the rain hadn't reached it. A single cigarette butt, hand-rolled, recently smoked. It didn't match any brand Carol Ann or her family used. Nobody in Alder Grove could account for it. Cutler was a careful man, and though there was nothing in 1961 he could do with a spent cigarette, something told him it mattered. He picked it up with a pair of tweezers. He sealed it in a small paper envelope. He wrote the date and the location on the outside in pencil, and he filed it with the rest. In his notes he wrote a single line that would look like prophecy 60 years later. May mean something someday. Hold on to it. Cutler worked that case harder than he'd worked anything in his life. He interviewed dozens of men. He looked hard at a drifter who'd passed through on the log trucks the week before, tracked him 2 counties over, and found the man had been in a county jail the night Carol Ann died, airtight. He looked harder still at a mill worker named Roy who'd asked Carol Ann to a dance twice and been turned down both times, and for a few days in November, the whole town was sure it was him. But Roy had spent that entire evening at his mother's house with 6 relatives who all swore to it, and Cutler, honest to the end, cleared him too. Each promising suspect who evaporated cost the family a little more hope. The physical evidence was thin. The rain had washed away most of it. Fingerprinting the scene was useless, and the cigarette butt, the one piece Cutler's instinct kept circling back to, was simply a thing he could look at and not read. The science to read it did not exist. While Cutler chased suspects, the Petrie family lived through their own separate nightmare a few streets away. Their father stopped sleeping. Danny, 11 years old, stopped talking almost entirely for a month, and the schoolteacher would later say the boy just stared at the window during lessons. He had convinced himself, in the private logic of a grieving child, that if he had only kept better watch on the porch light, he might have seen something. He carried that for decades. Somewhere in those same weeks, Cutler did what every investigator in a small town does. He interviewed the deliverymen, the ones who traveled every road at every hour and saw everything. Among them was the bread man, a friendly, unhurried fellow who ran the route through the north end of town, knew every family on Cedar Road, and had a kind word for everyone. Cutler wrote his name down, thanked him, and crossed him off. He seemed like the least likely man in Oregon. The case went cold before Christmas. And that was the first dead end, and it was the kind that closes slowly, the whole town going quiet around a grief nobody could aim at anything. Danny and his father lived on in the house with the porch light. Their father never really came back from it. He worked, he drank a little more each year, and he died in 1979 without ever knowing who took his daughter. Danny grew up in that same house, took a job at the mill like his father, married and stayed in Alder Grove his whole life. And every single year on the 12th of October, he called the county sheriff's office to ask if there was any news. Every year the answer was the same. Deputies who weren't even born when Carol Ann died learned to know his voice on the line, the way the whole town had once known hers. Sergeant Walt Cutler retired in 1974 and died in 1991. And to the end he kept a copy of the Petrie file in a footlocker at the foot of his bed. His widow said he took it out and read it every few months for 20 years, as if the answer might have moved. The years did what years do. By the 1990s, 30 years had passed, and the old evidence from the 1961 case had been moved twice, from the courthouse basement to a leaking storage annex, and back. The telephone exchange where Carol Ann had worked was torn down in 1978 when the town switched to automatic dialing, and the lot sat empty, and then became a parking lot. And the young people who parked there had no idea a girl's voice had once connected every call in Alder Grove from that spot. The alder stand on Cedar Road grew up thick and then was cleared for a new house, and the family that moved in never knew what had happened there. Danny's own children grew up, and then their children, and to them, Aunt Carol Ann was a black and white photograph on a hallway wall and a story that made the grown-ups go quiet. In 1994, during a records purge meant to clear space, a young clerk named Bonnie Ruiz was told to haul out and destroy anything from before 1965. She got as far as a water-stained cardboard box marked Petrie when something stopped her. She didn't know the case. She just couldn't bring herself to throw away a box with a young woman's name on it and a small paper envelope inside marked in an old detective's pencil. So she carried it back to the shelf and wrote "Hold" across the top in marker, and told no one, and forgot about it herself. That single act of hesitation is the reason there is a rest of this story. The forgotten box sat in the dark for another 29 years. Every case we bring you on this channel represents weeks of digging through old records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost long before most of us were born. If you want us to keep giving voices like Carol Ann's a chance to finally be heard, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Your support is the only reason this work is possible. Now, let's get back to Alder Grove. In 2023, the county sheriff's office received a small grant to review its oldest unsolved cases, and a cold case detective named Paul Ostrander pulled the Petrie file to see what, if anything, was left. What was left was a water-stained box-marked hold, and inside it, brittle but intact, the little paper envelope Walt Cutler had sealed 62 years before. Ostrander held it up to the light and read the pencil line on the outside. Hold on to it. Then he did the thing Cutler never could. He sent it to the state lab and asked if there was any way to pull Dina off a cigarette a man had smoked in the Eisenhower administration. There was. When a person smokes, they leave saliva on the paper, and saliva carries cells. And cells carry Dina that can survive for decades if it stays dry and undisturbed, which under a fern and then inside a paper envelope, it had. The lab recovered a full genetic profile from the 62-year-old cigarette butt. It belonged to a man, and it matched no one in any criminal database. And here is where the case left 1961 behind for good, because the investigators did something Walt Cutler could never have imagined. They turned to forensic genetic genealogy. The method is simpler than it sounds. Investigators upload an unknown killer's gnaw to the same public ancestry databases where ordinary people go looking for long-lost cousins. And then they trace the distant relatives who share pieces of that gnaw back down the branches of a family tree until those branches converge on a single name. It took a genealogist working with Ostrander the better part of 5 months to build that tree. They started with a pair of third cousins who had no idea their spit-in-a-tube ancestry test would one day help solve a murder, and worked backward and downward through birth records and obituaries and old census pages, narrowing a sprawling family down branch by branch. And then, on a gray afternoon in the fall of 2023, the branches came together on one name. Ostrander read it, and then he stopped. He pulled Walt Cutler's original 1961 file out of the box and turned to the list of men Cutler had interviewed and cleared. The name from the family tree was already on it, in Cutler's own handwriting, crossed out with a single pencil line. The bread man. The friendly one Cutler had spoken to for 10 minutes in an afternoon and never thought about again. His name was Earl Danvers, and to understand how he got away with it for 62 years, you have to understand how perfectly ordinary he was. Earl Danvers drove the bread route through the north end of Alder Grove for 19 years. He was at every door on Cedar Road at least twice a week. He knew which children liked the day-old sweet rolls he handed out for free. He knew every family's schedule, every wife's shift, every daughter's walk home, because that was his job, and he did it with a smile that no one ever once questioned. He knew that Carol Ann Petrie walked home alone up a dark gravel road at 9:20 every night she worked. He rolled his own cigarettes. Look back at it now, and the signs were there. Invisible only because no one had reason to look. He had been the last regular route through the north end that autumn. He'd been seen on Cedar Road at odd hours more than a bread schedule could explain. But a man that friendly, that woven into the daily life of the town, is the last man anyone suspects, and that invisibility was the only thing he ever really needed. He lived his entire life in that valley. He retired, went to church, buried a wife, was known by 3 generations as a gentle old man. He watched Danny Petrie grow up 2 streets over. He very likely stood in line behind members of the Petrie family at the market. And he died in his own bed in 2011 at the age of 83, never suspected, never questioned again after that single afternoon in 1961. When investigators confirmed the genealogy by obtaining a DNA sample from one of his surviving sons, who gave it willingly and had no idea what it would prove, the match was absolute. The man who brought bread to Carol Ann Petrie's own door had killed her 150 yards from it. When the sheriff announced the finding at a press conference in Alder Grove, the town that was left, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who'd searched Cedar Road in the rain went silent in the way a place goes silent when it learns a comfortable story it told itself for 2 generations was a lie. People remembered Earl Danvers. People had liked Earl Danvers. Some could not accept it even with the science laid out in front of them, but the DNA did not care what anyone remembered. Because Earl Danvers was long dead, there would be no trial, no arrest, no cell. The county could do only one thing, and it did it. It formally closed the murder of Carol Ann Petrie as solved and entered Earl Danvers' name into the record as her killer, permanently, in the place where it should have been for 62 years. It is not everything, but for a case this old, having the truth spoken out loud and written down for good is its own kind of justice. Carol Ann Petrie was 19 years old. She was the voice that connected a whole town's phone calls, the girl who raised her little brother when their mother died, the young woman who kept her dream in a coffee can labeled nursing and was less than a year from making it real. She left a porch light burning so that somebody would always know when she was safe. Her brother Danny is 73 now. He was there when the sheriff said the name aloud, and afterward a reporter asked him what he felt, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he mostly felt sorry for the boy of 11 who had sat up watching that light all night, waiting for a sister who was already gone, and who had gone on waiting, in one way or another, for 62 years. "I always knew somebody did this to her," he said. "I just never thought I'd live long enough to hear his name." Sergeant Walt Cutler did not live to hear it, but his hunch did, sealed in an envelope. And Bonnie Ruiz, the clerk who couldn't throw away a box with a young woman's name on it, is the reason there was anything left to test. When a reporter tracked her down, retired now herself, she said she'd never been able to explain why she saved it. Only that some names shouldn't be thrown in a dumpster. In the wake of the case, the county rewrote its evidence retention rules so that no physical evidence from an unsolved homicide can ever be destroyed, no matter how old, and pulled 3 more pre-1970 cases back onto the active list to see what modern testing might do. The oldest case that county ever solved was solved, in the end, by 3 ordinary people who refused to let a thing be lost, and 1 cigarette a careless man dropped in the rain and never thought about again. So I'll leave you with a few questions tonight. How many other cases from the 1950s and 60s still have their answers sitting untested in a paper envelope, waiting for a technology that already exists? What does justice even mean when the only punishment a killer ever faces is having his name attached to what he did, decades after he's safely in the ground? And of everyone in this story, was it the detective, the clerk, or the brother who never gave up, who mattered most in the end? Tell us what you think in the comments. Justice found Carol Ann Petrie after 62 years. Her story is why this channel exists, because the truth, however long it stays in the dark, still finds its way into the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here with us tonight.